Welcome to the last session, or rather last panel of the day. We have a book launch after this, but this is the last panel for Wow Kolkata. Beyond the Wall, Gautam Bhatia discusses his speculative fiction, The Wall, and its sequel with Sandip Roy. A little bit of introduction of both our panelists. Gautam Bhatia is the author of science fiction duology The Wall and the Horizon. He's also the coordinating editor of Strange Horizons, a weekly speculative fiction magazine that won the British Fantasy Award earlier this year. He's also known for his work on constitutional law, and if you're not following him on Twitter, please do. If he makes everything legal sound so easy and so much interesting for laymen like us. Sandip Roy is writer, radio host living in Kolkata. His work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Hindu, First Post, BBC, Scroll, and others. He is a columnist for Mint Lounge and hosts the Sandip Roy Show for Indian Express. His audio dispatch from Kolkata airs weekly on a public radio in San Francisco. His first novel is Don't Let Him Know. Okay. I'll ask Mr. Roy to start the session.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And this is actually my first hybrid session in this new world. So it's, I think, kind of appropriate. I'm starting it with a book on speculative fiction about a different world, because we've all been living in a sort of different world for this last couple of years. So Gautam, welcome virtually to Kolkata. We are glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I audible?
If you could let people know, where are you right now?
Yeah, I mean, I want to begin by just saying sorry, because I'm actually in Germany. I'm in Berlin, which you would think is the home of like tech advancement. And of course, my home internet just stopped working this morning, so I've had to come in via phone in this very grainy fashion. So I'm sorry about that. But yeah, the ironies of life, being in Berlin and not having internet, is just something I didn't expect would happen.
We all feel better about our internet bill. Like even let me get to this book, The Wall. And before we get into the subject matter of the book, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process. Unlike many other books where you create characters and plots, when you're writing a book of speculative fiction or science fiction, you actually have to create a world. You have to create the laws that govern the world. You have to create the geography of it. You have to create a history, the myths and legends that are part of that world. And all of us who've read our Tolkien or Isaac Asimov have experienced the delight of another world. But on the other side of it, when you're not the reader but the creator, can you talk a little bit about the challenges of creating this whole new world and making sure all the parts fit together?
Oh yeah, I mean, so I think that's a great question to start with, and that's honestly it's the most fun part of writing speculative fiction, but also the most frustrating and challenging part of it, because when you're effectively constructing a new world, you're constructing its physics, its economics, its politics, its that, and it needs to cohere. It needs to cohere in a way that's convincing and holds together. And I'll just give you a couple of examples from this book. As you know, this book, I mean, the city is surrounded by a wall. So it's basically a semi-closed system where water is abundant and, of course, air is abundant, but everything is constrained. All the other resources are there in finite quantities. So and there's no fauna inside the city. So one of the big question was, how do the plants exist without bees to pollinate them? Because this is a world without bees, right? And so then I had to basically ensure that every little piece of flora in the city was self-pollinating, and therefore it did not require bees to pollinate itself. One challenge that I had to get around. The other, of course, was that what about metal? And then I found that bog iron can actually be found in swamps and is renewable, so it's not a non-renewable source. Then the question was, but bog iron is extremely fragile as a metal, so if you're making weapons, they'll tend to break. And then I found that if you have basically, the Vikings used to do this, where they would mix bone with bog iron to make it much stronger. And so that allowed me to actually have a situation where you can actually have proper weapons in the city even with bog iron mixed with human bone. And then you of course have disposal of dead bodies. So there's so many things that you have to make sure come together to make the world convincing and not have it fall apart. So that was pretty much the biggest challenge and also the most fun part of it.
A new respect for both government as well as people like J.R.R. Tolkien after constructing this new world.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that there's a difference, I think, between world building and fantasy, where what really matters is the depth that you can project with your world, with its history, its poetry, its politics, and so on. But the J.R.R. Tolkien task is a little different. It's as hard and as challenging, but it's a little different. The world building in science fiction, I think, is a different kind of challenge in the sense that you're looking at more like the mechanics of it. So yeah, but definitely much more respect for science fiction world builders and fantasy world builders after that. It's extremely hard, and honestly, there were things that were emerging even until the last draft. Okay, how does this fit? And then actually, I mean, I'll tell you what, there are these substacks online where people have taken the trouble, experts in geography, geology, earth sciences, they basically take trouble to frame questions and answer them. So I found websites where some of the questions I had in mind about, like, say, water in a river, for it to be, for the evaporation to be kind of constant. There were questions that had been answered online by experts by science experts. Because ultimately, world building presents a set of challenges which are, of course, different for each book, but also ultimately quite similar. So many people had already asked these questions before. What is a self-sustaining population within like a closed system that could reproduce without genetic issues? And then a geneticist had actually answered that question. So it's quite a great world online in that sense, where there's a whole kind of people thinking about world building, about how to make things consistent, just always talking about it. So it's great that way.
I should, at this point, before I go to the next question, I did find this quote, which is ascribed to Tolkien, and it's a great quote where he says, "I wisely started with a map and then made the story fit the map." So that's one way to build a world, I guess. But let me talk about so in this book, you will find a lot of characters, like there are in all books. But what is interesting about The Wall is that these characters themselves, while they're individuals, are also part of groups, which Gautam delineates at the beginning of it. So what were the different groups that you wanted to create in this world? There are the priests called the Shurtans, there are the young Tarafians and stuff. So it seems like when you set out to create this world, along with particular characters, you wanted to represent certain groups who had different perspectives on what being a citizen meant. What was your goal there?
Yeah, I think it's a good way of putting it, and I think that what I had in mind was that ultimately the structure of a world will give rise to the conflict within it. So in this case, if you have this city that's surrounded by this very high wall that nobody's ever crossed, so nobody knows what's beyond it. Obviously, curious people will want explanations for how the wall came to exist beyond it. Why were we all put in this situation where there is this wall and nobody can go beyond it? And so, of course, you'll have a range of explanations for that. As in our world, there will always be a religious or a spiritual explanation that will attribute meaning to the way it does, and the meaning to our lives, right? So you'll always have that, and so you'll always have religion that is shaped around the very real characteristics of the world. Then you'll also, of course, always have people who are not satisfied with those explanations and will want to challenge authority and will want to challenge received wisdom and do what's forbidden, which is to, in this case, to go beyond the wall. So then you'll of course have, and then in our history, there are often students who are taking up that role of challenging authority. And then, of course, you will also have governing structure that will try to accommodate various kinds of conflicts, class conflict, religious conflict, and so on. Will try to accommodate that into a broadly peaceful society. So that gives you, the governing structure that again stems from the nature of the world itself. So I think these were some of the things that were in my mind when I was, kind of planning the social structures of the city and the economic structure.
Would you have been part of if you had been in the city of Sumer within the wall?
I think it's always a very dangerous enterprise to write yourself into a book. So no, I very consciously avoid doing that. I mean, I'd probably just be an ordinary citizen just getting by, and not any of the heroes. No.
We'll let you get away with that. But I think what is sort of interesting for people to know is that very often when we think of books of speculative fiction which create this world, we use words like dystopia and utopia and things
Yeah.
like that. But the city within the wall that Gautam has created here is not a dystopia in the sense of Handmaid's Tale or 1984 or even Prayag Akbar's Laila. It's a very orderly place where it is governed by very thoughtful people who are debating all of these things, much like the session we heard before on the Constituent Assembly. There are all these people who are different factions trying to figure out what is best for the people who live within the wall. In some sense, Gautam, when I was reading it, I'm like, this is almost like somebody's idea of I don't know, like a Singapore, like an orderly, not a dystopia, not a utopia, but an orderly topia of some things where everything is predictable and people follow the rules. How would you characterize the system of governance that you had in your mind in creating this?
Yeah, I think so. Ursula Le Guin in the Dystopia, a classic science fiction novel called Anares, which was her society, an ambiguous utopia. So I think that really puts it really well. So I think dystopias are fundamentally uninteresting. Yeah, okay, there's like oppression, there's suffering that either causes people to revolt or to be even more oppressed, right? And of course, you have great dystopic novels, 1984, Handmaid's Tale. I mean, that's all great stuff. I mean, it's not good. It's just that I find it really uninteresting because it's very pessimistic in certain way of the position. What I wanted to explore in this book was that, okay, you have a society where there is no visible suffering. People are not really going hungry, or there's of course a class structure and there's hierarchy, of course, but it's not that anybody is doesn't have enough to eat, or anybody is being ground underfoot by oppression in a way that they can't get jailed for no reason. It's a decent life as we understand it. The basics are provided for. And what I want to explore was that when you have that, even then can conflict arise, and even then can people say this is not enough for us, and we do want something else. And in this case, that is summed up by the fact that, okay, you have everything you need, but you have everything you need like in a confined space. Nobody has seen the horizon. The horizon as an idea is something that people cannot visualize. And so just this dream of being able to visualize the horizon, having a word for it, itself drives conflict, even though it's not a dystopia. So my idea was to explore that you have your basics in place, but you need, as human beings, you need something more than that. And then how do you explain to people that we have everything we need, but we still want something else? And how do you convince people of that? So that was what I was trying to explore here.
It's really interesting. So, there's often this idea that, oh, if you're an Inuit or an Eskimo, you have 1,000 words for snow, of different kinds of snow. But there are things in the Amazon rainforest that an Eskimo does not even have words for, because that is not in the realm of their experience. So here are these people who have spent all their lives and living and memory within this walled city, never knowing what lies beyond the wall. So literally the word horizon does not exist for them. It means nothing to them. So your character in this book, this woman named Mithila, has this yearning for the horizon. So how do you have a curiosity about something that you are not even aware of, that you don't even really know it exists? And there's a line in the book where people say, this is a very democratic kind of society, democratic as in a very recent kind of society. And you can vote against anything, there's a whole process there, but you cannot vote against the wall. So can you talk a little bit, Gautam, about setting, like what you had to go through in trying to imagine what curiosity would mean about something that does not exist in your legends, in your fiction, in your poetry, about something like as fundamental to us as the horizon?
Yeah, that's so one thing fascinated me has been the connection between language and the world, and the role that language plays, not just as a descriptor or as a referent, but also to construct the world. There's this really famous example that in Homer's Iliad, it begins with the phrase "the wine dark sea," and when you look at it, you're like, okay, the sea can be many things, but it's not the color of wine. So what's happening here? And in this book called Through the Language Glass, the argument is given by the author. It's very interesting that basically the Greek color spectrum was different from our color spectrum. So actually, like wine, like the color of wine was along a different spectrum where like green and wine red were visualized as being the same broad color. So our color spectrum, like green, red, orange, it's not the only way of organizing the world by color. But if you have a different color spectrum, you just look at the world differently, right? So that really something really interested me, and so I thought that okay, one thing that the wall does is that it literally affects the language you have, because you do words for a whole bunch of things, and then the struggle then is can you find a language for something you can't imagine, and once you have the language, then are you able to imagine it? And one of in a number of episodes in the book are about you have a word and then you try and actually imagine something you've never seen because you now have a word for it. So that was something I was trying to explore through that.
And what did you think of in such a world, what would be because you have a lot which is about poetry and song, but in there, but at the same time, it's an oral tradition. There's a stricture against writing it down. Why did you just want to keep it as an oral tradition?
Yeah, so this is another really, I think, interesting debate that's always fascinated me. Is between oral traditions and written traditions. And when you have an oral tradition, there's no concept of an original. So there's this really interesting book called The Singer of Tales by Milman Parry and Albert Lord, which talks about going to Central Europe to find out the source of the Iliad as an epic. And what they find is it was originally an oral tradition. And of course, in India also we have, in Rajasthan and other places, a lot of that Babuji tradition and so on. And what really stands out is that you can have no concept of the original, because each time in the oral tradition you're recreating through performance the epic all over again. Whereas the moment you fix it in writing, you then have like an original and everything flows from that. So one thing I wanted to explore was that in this city where because things are so limited, and you have a specific history that flows in a certain way. How would it affect whether you do writing or tradition? And also, of course, in a very economic way, because paper is limited, right, as other resources. So then you can almost forced to go the oral route, and how that would then affect the way society, politics, culture develops.
Which is sort of interesting. I mean, with speculative fiction, one of the great things is that you can speculate and create this world order, set its laws, play God, as it were. But at the same time, the reader is also constantly trying to map that world to worlds they know. And as a lawyer, you're intimately familiar with the world that we live in right now. This is something that you're constantly dealing with. So how do you match these two worlds in your head? Some people would say, oh, this idea that you, in this world, you can vote on anything but not against the wall is not that dissimilar from the world we live in right now, where we say, it's a democracy and everything is allowed, except if you say certain things, you will be called anti-national or whatever, and then ostracized. Or when you have this idea where people are saying, the basic needs of the citizens are met, but they still have a yearning for freedom. And what does that mean? Why do you want freedom? Why do you want the danger of what lies on the other side of the wall, the unknown? Which is not, in some sense, when I was reading it, I'm like, this is not very dissimilar to some of the arguments we heard in the Supreme Court during the privacy cases, where people said, well, this idea of privacy and personal freedom, that's a bit of a luxury in a poor country like India, where we have to first ensure that people's basic needs are met, and then we can talk about freedom and privacy. So, I mean, was our current situation also playing in your mind as you were writing this?
I think you began with the Tolkien quote about the map. The Tolkien quote I like a lot, which is that I cordially agree in all its forms. So I think that to answer the question, definitely is not meant to be an allegory or to draw from any contemporary events quickly. Because again, I think that when a speculative fiction writer, you start to it's a very quick road to like telling a good story. Of course, in the sense that the story is informed and real life events. You have a dispute over land, for example, and there's many historic conflicts over land reform, structure of governance, where you vote in a referendum on issue before for representatives, drawn from some proposals in medieval. So in that sense, of course, every world building is in some way influenced or inspired by the world in which we live in. But I very consciously, any direct drawing contemporary India, because I think that that's job of fiction. It's not the task of speculative fiction of this kind to I think maybe kind of a moral or ethical engagement with society currently. It's something else that we're trying to do.
Struggle because people keep looking at you. I mean, is it easy for you to keep these hats of Gautam Bhatia, constitutional lawyer, dealing with these questions, and Gautam Bhatia, speculative fiction writer, dealing with these questions, but in a world that is not our world?
So I think it's a good. One thing that was hard to do was change your writing style, because when you're drafting in law to be as precise and make the point in as clear a way as you use the fewest number of words. Well, I mean, there's legal drafting, but I mean that's the idea to that, and to basically be as direct as you can. Whereas in fiction, the whole point is to get in directly, because if you're writing direct, again, you could be like Hemingway, of course, but the task is to do it indirectly. And it really affects you a lot when you're doing dialogue, because you're so used to the written form or the written voice that changing it to oral voice is very, very hard if you're used to legal drafting. And that's where good editors, good beta readers really play an impact. So I think that was it was difficult to keep to that way in terms of writing. In terms of imagining, not so. But again, the thing is that as a writer, of course, you know the reception of your book. And so what I did that people really insisted on reading law into it exist. So as you read, later on in the book, there's a room scene. There's a debate happening over the question of going beyond the wall, and that has nothing to do with the way any real court is. Completely different. It's Star Trek kind of courtroom scenes where the court is just like a vehicle to kind of like back and forth in dialogue. But people kept on insisting on reading like law in scene, and there's constitutional debate happening. I was like, no, debate is just like an argument that genre often has used in the past. The courtroom as a vehicle to do that. So actually, you should look at of how this scene science fiction tradition, and not projecting law into fiction. So that's happened a lot, and as it's been amusing at times, frustrating at times. But the author is dead. It will the book
I
as well.
read one of the reviews, Gautam, where they said that you seem as or even more excited in the scenes where the debate is happening in the courtroom or their version of the elders, their version of parliament, than in the real action sequences when people are trying to dig their way under the wall. You're equally excited by both, and I think people are reading Gautam Bhatia, constitutional lawyer, into the book as well. But the issues that
Sure, I
that
mean,
are debated in the book, Gautam, are ones that we do tussle with. And for example, because this is a city that is framed by a wall, and as Gautam has said, is limited in terms of resources, a problem he has to deal with constantly as a writer is, what do you do with population? Population increases, and this is a finite space. And so somehow you have to create checks and balances to keep the population manageable. And in there, the laws come up with different systems to do that, which you can, on one side, argue are very unfair, the way they penalize people for having more children. On the other side, you can sort of rationally see an argument for it. And I'm sorry, I'm going to map it to our world right now. We similarly have these debates right now occasionally in many countries, including our own, around population control. People float ideas saying, oh, if you have more than 3 children, you should not be eligible for government benefits and things like that. But what I found interesting in the book is that you say there are no black and white answers as to which side is good and which side is bad. You try and see, at least I felt reading the book, logic on both sides. Can you talk a bit about that? Because as a constitution lawyer, you have a certain view on what is constitution, what is not. But here, when you're doing with the real life practicality of this city, you seem to be much more happy with that grayness.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, what's important in fiction and speculative fiction, that's kind of social science fiction. First of all, make sure that that both sides have good arguments. I of caricatures, which is probably I do more like science fiction than fantasy, although I'll say. But in fantasy, I mean, again, this is a bit reductive, and it's not really all fantasy. The good and the evil with this, but it is clear who is right and who is in fantasy. Whereas the whole point is that the end of the book it's obviously an indication of what side the author is on. But the reader should at least have some doubt about who is wrong, or if there is. I think that the whole point of good science fiction, frame the question, but not to prescribe an answer, which is again something you see that Ursula well, because in the Dispossessed, which is classic, you have these two, Anares and Uras, and Anares is anarchist, ambiguous utopia, and Uras is kind of to our capitalist world. And when you start the book, you think, okay, like clear is like the good and Uras is the bad. But Ursula Le Guin keeps on challenging those assumptions through the book, and at the end of it, you still think that, but you are much less sure. I think that's the point. The point is that, okay, in this book, for example, the question of is right or wrong to risk the entire stability by going beyond the walls. You need horizon is, or like deal with the journey. Is it right or is it wrong? I think that's a question that's your answer. And even though the hero or the protagonist on one side, that doesn't mean the reason on that side. So I think that was the idea. It was sure that everyone, including the religion, the priests and all, everyone has an argument, that they're not just naked power oppression, do so because I am saying so, but everyone has, and you are invited to deal with those there.
That is sort of interesting, because unlike, say, a Mount Everest, where you say, why did Hillary and Norway need to climb Mount Everest? And often the answer is because it's there. You could sort of say, why do you need to go across the wall? Because it's there. But unlike Mount Everest, if this character Mithila is successful in crossing the wall, it actually will affect everybody else in the city who lives in the wall. It is possibly opening a Pandora's box. And even as Gautam is right, in the beginning we are following these young Tarafians led by Mithila in their quest to try and go across somehow breach the wall. But as it progresses, you start to see the other people's point of views too, as to why they don't want that to happen. They don't want to find out what is other, because they say, we are fine here, why do you want to risk the unknown? And I wanted to see if people had questions, but before that, let me ask you a quick thing. One of the things you do interestingly in this book is this is led by a matriarch in the society, and you show Mithila is in a relationship with another woman named Rama, and that same-sex relationship is not only just matter of fact, it is actually regarded as a higher form of relationship, as a pure union, which when you come to think of it in a place of limited resources makes more sense, because these are the people, they are probably not going to have children who will compete for resources. How did that idea come about for you?
So, one thing that is always there, when you have the liberty or the privilege of being able to devise a whole new world, you have the complete choice to decide what structures of oppression and power you're going to stick with in that world, right? Like, you have that choice, which we don't have in the real world. And so, in that sense, like, why should heteronormativity or necessarily exist in a totally different world with totally different history? And in fact, in a world like this, like you said, economy actually, which forms the base of economic and social relations, actually it makes sense for same-sex relations to be valorized and not subjected to prejudice. So I think that the important thing actually is that you have this thing from scratch with building this. You really have to say, okay, I mean, these are all the really ugly forms in my world. Why map on to another world that and when we know by now that there is no such thing as human nature, it is obviously always by surroundings. So I think that so a queer normative world, which is the technical term used, is just another choice you make. Of course, the writing of it is a different matter, because you obviously have to make it faithfully, and then as a person myself, you obviously have to make sure you're doing it properly, and that's where sensitivity reads, editing, having it read by people really is important. It's crucial to make sure that you're not going wrong, respecting people, you're not accusing people in that way. So that the right is hard, it's a challenge, but to do it, I think, is a no-brainer for me.
Quite fascinating, because while reading it, you realize that you also have to question all your assumptions about all the systems that we sort of take for granted, all the isms that we take for granted, and think like, if you were building a world from scratch, which ism would you prescribe for it, if any of the known isms that are out there, or what you can challenge. So I mean, I have other questions, but if people had questions for Gautam, please raise your hand and we'll try and get to them.
Well, how does it feel to be in Berlin, with the wall, and the fact that the wall was demolished in Berlin? So it's very interesting that Gautam is
in Berlin.
And there's internet trail today, and we are discussing the wall, which means that if the Berlin Wall can break, then any wall can break, because for many years the finality of the Berlin Wall was there. So it's very significant, Gautam, and so would you like to reflect on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's my first day in Berlin. I went to Checkpoint Charlie. I saw the remnants of the Berlin Wall that are there. So it's pretty significant. I think of the Berlin Wall is the history of a wall seems to be permanent and impervious, but then comes down. But it's not as if it's going to come down on its own if you wait for it to come down. So it still needs to bring it down. And I think that core theme of the wall and the sequel, The Horizon, is that like it ultimately will be one person who brings it down. It has to be a collective to bring that change, that allow it to come down.
The other comment is about the choice of the name Mithila as the lead matriarch, you know. So, is some reflections of the Mithila of the past, or was it just, I mean, was it just random to have thought of Mithila as the main protagonist?
And also, in that vein, choosing the word Sumer, which we think of with associated with the Sumerian civilization, as the name for this city.
Yeah, so my name I like a lot. It wasn't. So one was easy. The other was stands for Earth. So I'm kind of making following that was it fit well. So it was both a name I liked just as a name, and there was this kind of significance to it. Sumer actually, this is a funny thing. I mean, I realized only later that it's actually, I mean, the association would be with the Sumerian civilization. When I was first concept, actually, I based it on Meru, like center of kind of the earth, and then kind of cut the U to make it like a little less directly, but I didn't even think that then if it became, people would then immediately and rightly so link it with Sumerian civilization. So, I mean, I guess like again, it's a question of the reception. One was to base it more on Meru than like Sum civilization.
Well, since you actually mentioned the second part of this, is it going to be a trilogy or a pentalogy, or what do you have in mind?
Yeah, it's a duology. Book 2 Horizon. It's in fact it's out in book as of 2 weeks ago, and Amazon official launch is like November 10th, and the series finishes with the Horizon. 2 books, The Wall and The Horizon, and then the series.
I don't want to give away the ending of The Wall for those who haven't yet read it, but if you could talk a little bit about what you wanted to do with the Horizon. Exactly. I don't want to give it away, so I'll leave it up to you to tread into that minefield of talking about Horizon without giving away enough too much about The Wall.
Yeah, no, The Wall focuses a lot on setting out the world, kind of, and setting up fundamental conflicts that were within it. The main being, what to do about the wall to cross. And so it raised a number of questions with respect to who built the wall, what lies behind, why does the wall exist, is the history of the city, basically. And what I can say is that the Horizon will answer questions. So the questions you're left with are answered, most of them, and characters will basically, there'll be you all see them again. They'll have more, and there's a lot more action. Like it's the wall was more like deliberative, just setting it up. Yeah. So there'll be like a lot more action, but yeah, it'll answer the question.
Other questions? You can also ask about the Constitution. I don't know if he wants to talk about Constitution and law, but since you've got him here as a captive audience, you can ask him about that if you want to. Well, let me ask you one thing. We talked about this myth about how this, because once the wall is there, you have to create a myth to justify it. And the story that these people have learned is that this sort of race, which you could call as gods in our building, are called the builders. They built the wall, and they built it as a result of some kind of human transgression. And there was a transgression happened, and as a punishment almost for that is that the humans were now confined to live within this wall. But it is sort of, to me, it read like the inverse of the Eden story. Because in the Eden story, you committed the transgression of eating the forbidden fruit, and then you were cast out of Eden into the world. Whereas here, the penance of the transgression is that you're put into a sort of small Eden, as it were, a self-sustaining ecosystem. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely. So it was, of course. So I think one thing that fascinates me is this idea of transgression, like across color, that you're told not to do something good, you still end up doing it because that's what we human beings are like, and then consequences. And of course this case, a cross between the Lakshman Rekha story in the Ramayana. So like thing Lakshman Rekha when Lakshman says like it. But what you have in common is this idea that someone who knows better own protection tells you don't do X. That is exactly when you do X, and then you. So I wanted to explore that, and of course, invert that a little bit. I think science fiction, speculative fiction, is take these really classic stories and legends about human beings, really about I think maintaining authority and kind of and showing how authority is like a good thing as long as you do it. And it's bad to not do it, and you can in your world building. So that was the exact inversion that you're talking about. Just like think a little deeper about ways in which the myths of our society is linked up with this desire to preserve authority and so on.
Now, having written this book, has it made, and having to examine all your fundamental assumptions about the systems of governance, why they exist, having to inhabit the head of the Shurtan priest caste, as well as the heads of the young Tarafians who are trying to breach the wall, as well as the elders who are trying to find some kind of balance between the two sides, the scientists. Do you think you would approach arguments when you in your constitutional lawyer hat on? Do you think you would approach them differently? Do you have more empathy for all sides of the argument right now?
No, I think the two will be pretty separate in the sense that because the thing is that when you're doing constitutional law, you have to like play that are given to you, and you have a certain form of argument, a certain vocabulary to it. So you can't set those rules, right? Yeah, well, you may have empathy for the other side's arguments, but you'll have to argue in a certain way. That way, you're more. Well, what I will say is that reading a lot in and around building part of this book, all the research that it took, it definitely has made me a lot more skeptical about the state itself as an idea, and of course the constitution and the state. So I guess I'm more skeptical about constitution, but yeah, it's definitely made me more skeptical about the state, and it's made me explore a little more and take seriously of philosophical anarchism. So I don't mean anarchism like caricature of anarchy, throwing bombs and stuff randomly, and caricature, but this idea of societies that do not need a authority like a state to function. And full examples, for example, Elin, the economist, has some amazing on how you don't need a state or a private market to take care of like commons. So she has examples of how societies have gotten together and created for themselves a set of norms that govern how one resource can be regulated. So you need a top-down state. You don't need private ownership. You can have it in this way. So I've become much more interested, at least as in terms of reading and thinking, and maybe for future fiction, although not for constitutional, these ideas.
I think we're almost out of time here, so I'll do one last call for anybody with a question for Gautam. Going. Well, thank you so much, Gautam, for joining us, despite your braving the internet connection and from Berlin to join us today for the closing session of this festival. We look forward to the sequel to The Wall, and hope it will expand all our horizons.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you so